Imagine waking up to find your entire city just gone, not damaged, completely erased by fire in a single night. That is not a nightmare. That actually happened in America, and almost nobody knows the full story. This fire burned for days across hundreds of miles. Firefighters had no chance of stopping it. The heat was so intense it created its own weather system. Whole towns disappeared before people even knew what was coming. And here's the part that really gets me. This could happen again. The warning signs were ignored, the alarms were silenced, and the truth was buried. What you are about to hear will rewrite everything you thought you knew. This is not just a story about flames. This is a story about power, failure, and a disaster America tried to forget. The real facts are darker than anything you have seen in a textbook. And trust me, the closer we get to the truth, the more disturbing it becomes. If that is the kind of history you are hungry for, you need to subscribe to History Lab right now. We dig up the stories that others are too afraid to tell. Hit that subscribe button and stay locked in because this story is only getting started. It was October of 1871, and America had no idea what was about to hit it. The summer that year had been dangerously dry. Rainfall across the Midwest was lowest anyone had recorded. Farmers noticed their fields were like kindling, dry, brittle, desperate for rain. Forests that should have been green looked like they were already dead. Then the winds came sweeping down from the northwest, hot and relentless. The whole region was a powder keg just waiting for a single spark. And that spark came on the night of October 8th. Now, most Americans think the Great Chicago Fire was the big story of 1871. Honestly, that fire was devastating. Over 300 people died and 17,000 buildings burned. But Chicago was not even close to the worst fire of that night. That same evening, a fire ignited in a small Wisconsin town called Peshtigo. And what happened there makes Chicago look like a campfire. The Peshtigo Fire killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people in a single night. Some historians believe the real number could be even higher. Records were destroyed because the town itself was destroyed. And here is where it gets really disturbing. People in Peshtigo had almost zero warning before the fire reached them. Survivors described a sound like a freight train roaring out of the forest. The fire moved faster than any human being could outrun. One witness said the sky itself turned completely red in seconds. Animals fled through the streets in blind panic, crashing into people trying to escape. The fire generated winds strong enough to lift full-grown men off the ground. Entire families were found huddled together, burned where they stood. This was not a normal fire. This was something far more terrifying. Scientists now call what happened a firestorm. A firestorm is when a fire gets so large and so hot it creates its own wind system. Those winds feed oxygen directly back into the flames. The more it burns, the bigger and hotter and faster it gets. It becomes self-sustaining, a living, breathing monster of fire. Temperatures inside the Peshtigo firestorm reached over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt glass and turn sand into liquid. Nothing in the path of that heat had any chance of surviving. Wait, this next part shocked even historians. The fire did not stay in one town. It jumped across the Menominee River like that water was not even there. Over 1 million acres of forest burned across 2 states in one night. 12 communities were completely wiped off the map. Some of those towns have never been rebuilt. They simply ceased to exist. The fire burned so hot in some areas that investigators found no human remains at all. People had been completely incinerated, nothing left to identify or bury. Survivors pulled from rivers were barely alive, their lungs scorched from the heat. Now let us talk about why nobody saw this coming, because this disaster did not happen without warning signs. Logging companies had been stripping the forests for decades leading up to 1871. They left enormous piles of dry wood waste scattered across the landscape. Those piles were basically giant stacks of natural fuel just sitting there. Nobody required the companies to clean them up or dispose of them safely. Railroad crews building new lines through Wisconsin were also burning debris constantly. Small fires had been burning in the region for weeks before October 8th. Local officials were warned that the fire risk was dangerously high, and yet nothing was done because money was more important than safety. But the truth about the Peshtigo Fire is far darker than you think. The fire was not just a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe. Decades of reckless logging had turned the Wisconsin forest into a death trap. The railroad industry had stripped the land and left it bone dry, and corporate interests made sure regulations stayed weak and toothless. When the fire finally came, there was no system in place to warn people. There were no firefighting resources capable of handling something that size. There was no federal response plan, no emergency protocol of any kind. People were on their own against a monster that an entire government could not stop. And here's where it gets really disturbing. After the fire, Chicago got all the attention and all the relief funds. The story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow became legendary across the whole country. But Peshtigo, where 10 times more people died, was almost completely ignored. Relief money trickled in slowly while thousands of survivors had nothing. No food, no shelter, no medicine, no clothes as winter began to close in. Survivors of the deadliest fire in American history were essentially abandoned. The political class was too distracted by Chicago to care about Wisconsin, and so the story of Peshtigo was quietly pushed aside and forgotten. That silence lasted for generations. Most American school children today have never once heard of Peshtigo. Chicago's fire is in every history book. Peshtigo barely gets a footnote. And that tells you something powerful about whose stories get told in this country. The people who died in Peshtigo were farmers, loggers, immigrants, working families. They were not wealthy, they were not politically connected, and they were not famous. So the system that failed them also erased them from the history books. But we have not learned nearly enough from what happened that October night. The same combination of drought, wind, and dry forests exists across America today. Logging and development still strip away the natural fire breaks that protect communities. Climate change is making fire seasons longer, hotter, and more unpredictable every single year. Fighting resources are still stretched dangerously thin in the most vulnerable regions, and powerful economic interests still fight against the regulations that could save lives. We are not as far from 1871 as we want to believe. The Peshtigo Fire was not just a tragedy, it was a warning that America heard about 5 minutes and then completely forgot. Every time we ignore fire risk for the sake of profit or convenience, we are repeating that mistake. The names of those 2,000 people who burned deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told with the same urgency and weight as any other disaster. Because if we forget what happened in Peshtigo, we are setting ourselves up to live it again. That is exactly why History Lab exists, to make sure these stories are never buried again. If you believe hidden history matters, subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, why do you think Peshtigo was forgotten? Share this video with someone who thinks they know American history, because real history is not what they taught you in school, and we are just getting started.